Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Adam Chandler. He's a journalist and author based in New York, a former staff writer at The Atlantic. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Wired, Vox, State, New York Magazine, Texas Monthly, Esquire, Time, and elsewhere. He's the author of Drive-Thru Dreams, a journey through the heart of America's fast food kingdom, and is a recurring guest on History Channel's The Food That Built America. He regularly appears across television, radio, and digital platforms, including CBS Sunday Morning, NPR's Planet Money, Morning Edition, and Here and Now. And his newest book, available now, is called 99% Perspiration, a new working history of the American way of life. Adam, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I got to shorten my bio, man. That's way too long, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely, man. And then so in his book, Adam wrote, writing this makes me feel a bit like the most stoned kid on an ultimate frisbee team. But America isn't what we're told it is. I'm not saying anything that you don't already know. Aided mightily by bad weather and handouts from the French, we fumbled our way into independence, despite not having a set goal of nationhood or even a common conception of it. And we've remained in jumble of competing energies and priorities ever since. Observers, at least as far back as Alexis de Tocqueville, in the early 1800s have noticed the clash between the forces of individualism and conformity in American life and culture. We are now a diverse, self-proclaimed melting pot composed of communities that are increasingly separated or gerrymandered, I love that you threw that in there, apart by factors like race and income and political ideology. We've had countless chances to make something real and resilient of our opportunities, and we screwed the pooch on a lot of them. We've also done and continue to do things that make people the world over look on us with hope, admiration, disappointment, and disgust. We remain both utterly predictable and full of surprises. Phenomenal piece of writing. So I'm going to start with this. So I want to kind of like bring it all the way back. So I just want to make a quick comment. So because I'm a psychotherapist, this is a psychology podcast. I write about psychology. So I often write about a concept that most people don't really, or find it kind of hard to like, not just understand, but they tend to misrepresent it. This concept of moral masochism. So when I talk about moral masochism, a very psychoanalytic concept, it just means pretty much kind of suffering and striving and pretty much sacrificing for some greater future. And so when we think about it, we often think about it in the context of success, right? So it's a very American way of living. And oftentimes when I write about it or I talk about it with people, I often say, well, the reason why success is a moral issue, because the way it's framed oftentimes is that if you're successful, you're a good person. So people are like, they're sort of flabbergasted by this, right? They're like, that doesn't make any sense. What does one have to do with the other? That just sounds like masochistic. How is that moral, right? So I want you to take us back now to the Puritan work ethic. I want you to take us back to the sort of foundations of the American way of life. And how the hell did we get to the point where work has now equated with goodness?
Right. It's a good question. And it's an important question because, the harder that it gets to get by in America, and there are real challenges. I mean, we have people working really hard every day here that aren't getting ahead, even though that's kind of what we're told from birth, like work hard, you'll get to where you want to go. There's a lot of shame involved in that. There's a lot of helplessness and almost a fear of asking help because it makes you look like you aren't self-reliant. There are all these big themes, and they go back to the very beginning. In the book, I start with Columbus in large part because, I mean, not to get too in the weeds of the history, but if you asked someone who was living in the American colonies in 1760s who discovered America, they would probably say John Cabot or Henry Hudson. You were a British citizen. The British explorers, made their way up through the country, and you would have a reasonable claim to say that they discovered it, even though there are already people living here. But as Americans started moving toward independence from the British, they wanted a new figure, a new symbol of who would represent the new world, this new idea. And that's where Columbus really became popular. And part of the reason why I wanted to focus on that is because what America was founded on was the idea that you could sort of transcend your station in life. You could be mobile. You could be socially mobile. You could go from rags to riches, whatever the cliche or trope is. It was meant to be true. And that was different. That was a different revolutionary idea. In Britain, at the time, you had essentially the idea was you were born into your station. You know, they had titles of nobility. If you watch one of those old movies that take place in the 1700s, they taught, you know, even through Downton Abbey, you have all these people who are born into their stead, and they don't work for it. They just acquire they acquire it through birth. And America was meant to be something different, and it's a really beautiful idea, and it's in our Constitution. No titles of nobility is part of our the fabric of our country. But what gets tricky about this idea is, as soon as you make success or failure a question of virtue, and this goes through the Puritan work ethic, this goes through the Great Depression, this goes through the frontier, all of these big keystone moments have this sort of energy around success and opportunity. And if you don't make it, then you didn't try hard enough. And that's where things get really messy. And that's, I think, a lot of why people are so upset right now, because they are working hard, or they want to work hard, and they just don't have the way, the possibility to get where they want to be.
And this actually takes me back to, I'm actually curious about the history. In terms of the history of exploitation and slave labor, how has that kind of shaped the way work is valued in America today?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question in large part because we're still grappling with it. I mean, we are still afraid to kind of say, we, you know, we're established as a nation with this ideal, with these ideals of freedom and equality and social mobility. But we also, at the same time, we're a country where we had a whole workforce that wasn't being compensated, that was held in bondage. And it's a real sore point for us to grapple with that. There have been a lot of recent examples where people trying to kind of teach a more nuanced and complicated and accurate version of American history have been, you know, run out of their jobs or silenced or censored. And it's not that, it's a stronger story for us to say we grew into a country that learned more and knew better. You know, we have these ideals around the history of who we are, and we like to mythologize them and make them seem better than they are. It's totally natural to do that. But I would say that there's a better version of the story. And this goes back to the founding too. The founders, contrary to like popular perception, really didn't like each other that much. They had all these ideological disagreements. They came from different places. They had different religious orientations. They had all of these really philosophical, fundamental differences. And in spite of all of that, they managed to come together and find a way to find a working governance here in the US. I mean, it took them a while. We had the Articles of Confederation, which failed. We had all these hiccups and road bumps along the way. But eventually they found a way to make it all work. And I think that that's a better version of the story than like, this is, you know, the founders all came together and were against British tyranny. That's not true. You know, we're the three of us are in New York right now. New York was a loyalist hotbed. We wanted nothing to do with independence by and large. This is where like people were hiding out during the war. It was very different. And so I look to those stories as a way to sort of say, compromise and interdependence, us getting along with each other and figuring out how to respect each other, has actually been the way that we've gotten by, not because we all believe the same things and feel the same things. And that is a story that takes us all the way back to before we were even a country.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember, so as I'm going through your work, what I started thinking about, so a while ago, I don't know, about maybe kind of over a decade ago, I guess. So I was a staunch libertarian. And so, you know, if you're kind of in that movement, you have these myths about what it's like, you know, kind of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, sort of kind of using your own ingenuity and wit to get by. And so what's interesting about that is that, you know, I remember not really looking too deeply into these particular stories. So as, you know, as we're kind of, I guess, sort of growing up, and as we're watching TV and reading literature, and you know, we're kind of sort of finding ways to inspire ourselves. What we normally think of, or what we normally try to think of, is like, how do we kind of relate to these people, right? What are these traits that we can kind of either inculcate or you know, maybe manifest in some ways? Maybe they're already kind of latent in us, but we hardly ever think about the structures that exist around them, right? So what I love is that the name of your book is the Thomas Edison quote, in part, the 99% perspiration. But you know, you're kind of saying, hey, even sort of Edison was like, not so much, right? right? So can we actually get into some of these myths, right? So we have, Horatio Alger, but specifically we have the Henry Fords and the Thomas Edisons and even the Elon Musks. And then so can we now talk about, so because people are definitely going to ask, well, how do you know that that's a myth, right? How are you able to say that they weren't able to do it on their own?
Right. I mean, it's not, again, it's sort of nuancing that big story, right? It's not a knock on Thomas Edison to say that he hired really smart people or that he took advantage of government opportunities, whether it was, government funded research or subsidies, or he hired smart people that came up through our education system.
Mhm.
The problem with making someone like Thomas Edison as this singular genius is that it makes it seem like there was no community that built it, that we are all invested in this idea of success and prosperity, and we all contribute to it. And that's something that gets left out of the story when we focus on individual genius mavericks, which is like which is a big theme in our history. We like to elevate the individuals, and that's kind of who we are as a country. Thomas Edison, he had a mentor that taught him telegraphy and all kinds of important sort of scientific processes that he, again, benefited from having somebody who said, I see something in you and I'm going to take you under my wing. That doesn't happen to everybody. And if it did, a lot more people would make it. He had inventors working under him that were also geniuses, also very smart people. The reason why the light bulb, for example, is this life-changing, concept, this life-changing invention, was because Lewis Latimer, who was a Black American inventor who worked with Edison, created a carbon filament inside the bulb that made it possible for the light bulb to last long enough so that you weren't changing the light bulb every 5 minutes. And therefore it became accessible to the masses. Everyone could buy light bulbs for their houses with electricity. And so this became a big deal. But we don't hear about Lewis Latimer a lot. We hear about Thomas Edison. We think about Thomas Edison and the light bulb. But this is just an example of how, other people and other inventors and communities and offices and teams build these great things. And we tend to focus on someone like Thomas Edison or Elon Musk, whose hero is Thomas Edison, by the way. And Elon Musk is also held up as this singular genius, but he gets billions of dollars in taxpayer grants and research and contracts. He benefits from the infrastructure that our tax dollars go to, from our government research in colleges, from our education system, and all of these tax incentives and tax cuts that we give to rich people. So it's not as if he's done this on his own. And it again makes it a better story for all of us if we think about how we're all contributing to these big projects that are changing the world. And we should benefit from them more as a result.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something like this is sort of the way I think about it, or like kind of my inclination. So when I think about the bootstraps narrative and the way people are sold stories on people like Edison, Henry Ford, Elon Musk, like speaking to your point right now, of course, if you really look into it, of course, there are whole communities, whole networks of people that kind of contribute to their success and the success of, let's say, Elon Musk's company. But what do you think, what kind of psychological or cultural forces actually kind of keep these, self-made men kind of narratives in place?
Good question.
Yeah. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah,
I
that's
was
a
gonna say
very good
more,
question.
but
That's
I'll
a
leave it
very
at
good
that.
question.
Yeah, it's a great question. We've relied on this self-made ideology because we have a lot of policy and a lot of cultural things that back that up. We don't have a strong safety net in this country. If you compare us to other nations that we like to compare ourselves to, in the book I talk about going to France, and basically they have all these systems in place where you get free. First of all, everyone has healthcare. You don't have to have a job to have healthcare. They have subsidized or even free pre-K and childcare for young people so they can get back to work after having kids and after the initial sort of postnatal period. They have all of these ways to kind of keep people they have really robust public housing. I think 70% of French people live in public housing, or it might just be Paris. But nice public housing, it's they invest in these things, and they invest and it's not a perfect place to live by any stretch of the imagination, but places that have real strong social safety nets, it means that if you hit a road bump, if you have a parent that gets sick, if you have something that takes over your life, that means that you can't work, the state will kind of support you. And that idea is really unpopular here, culturally and historically. The idea that you would rely on anyone else but yourself is seen as weak and as being not self-actualized. It is really held up as a thing of shame. And the reality of it is that it's really hard to get by on your own, and we're seeing the proof of that in American life right now. We have so many people who are working so many jobs and are unable to create stability, much less wealth, much less the kind of wealth you want, just get by. And if we wanted a more durable economy, if we wanted a more cohesive society, we would invest more in people. And that goes against the philosophical ideals of the self-made person, because they in theory, needed no help, but they got help. They all got help. There's not a single story of anyone we would put on a entrepreneurial Mount Rushmore that didn't have some kind of leg up, some kind of teacher, some kind of grant, some kind of mentor, some kind of tax break, some kind of system around him that made it happen. And we downplay those systems. We say that they're not important. We're currently, politically, not to get too much in the weeds about this, but we're cutting a lot of government infrastructure right now that provides assistance, but also creativity and outlets and social cohesion for people. And it's important to recognize that those are how we become a better and more interesting and more developed country. It's not just all about the grind. It's about the creativity. It's about meeting people with different perspectives than you and learning from it. That's also how we grow.
Yeah.
And just to tag this, do you think that just because of the way that the narrative is constructed around becoming a self-made person or these self-made people, that is just the way it's sold to people, it's just so simple? Like, for example, when I was younger, like in college, you hear, okay, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, these people didn't finish college, they dropped out, and
Right.
They were still able to make something of themselves, and you can do that too. You don't necessarily need this or that particular avenue. You don't need to necessarily get through college to have this done. And it seemed like such a sweet narrative at the time, because I was just thinking, okay, all right, so then if I model myself around these people, I could probably reproduce the same results. At that time, I was even looking at other principles in not psychology, but there was this thing called, I'm not going to get too into the weeds here, but there was something called NLP at the time. It's something called neuro-linguistic programming. Supposedly, if you model someone else's their trajectory or their patterns, their behavior, you can reproduce the same or similar results.
Become a disruptor.
So all of a sudden, I'm combining this and then hearing these narratives, and it just seemed like such a sweet, simple pitch to me. But it never occurred to me to actually really think, okay, what kind of resources did these people have? Who are the people they were connected with? What was their social network? Like, okay, so you dropped out of college, but you knew a whole bunch of other like high achieving people in your network that maybe helped you to get something done. Maybe you have not a nest egg, inheritance, maybe, or something like that.
And maybe you broke the law.
And maybe you broke the law.
Right.
Yeah. So do you think it's just that like the way the narrative is sold is just like it's so neatly presented like that, people just find it easy to digest and don't tend to think about it further
and believe they can emulate it?
Yeah. I mean, well, we get our cultural cues from these things, these stories of people who, rugged pioneers who, conquered the frontier, pilgrims who came over here looking for freedom. and those stories all have very complicated things around them that make them a little less simplistic than, you'd want them to be in middle school, elementary school, high school, college, and in life. But those are the things that we kind of rely on. I think it's hard to see it because it's so much in our face. It's sort of, I don't want to call it programming because that sounds sinister, but it is very much just the way that we kind of orient ourselves here, to focus on individualistic sort of methods of success and achievement. We're very focused on that. And it's just different in other places. And I think that that's really what makes it difficult to see, is that when you go other places and you see, well, there are all these other things that are in place for, to help me along my journey that are different. It's just not obvious because it's so ingrained in us that I think it's almost hard to see. It's like it's almost invisible because it's so pervasive. It just kind of takes like zooming out and actually looking at it. That's actually really what I'm trying to do in writing a book about work, is thinking about how we became this work obsessed country where we are so focused on individual achievement, why we are so focused on working more hours. In Denmark, for example, their foreign ministry has this entry on their website, which is amazing, where they talk about what the Danish office is typically like. They say, we usually at 4 o'clock, everyone tends to leave the office to go home to prepare the evening meal, and they don't work any more than 37 hours a week. And if you are in the office at 7 o'clock, it is extremely unnatural. Here, there is this heroic sort of imagery or sort of this virtue in being at the office at 7 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, whatever it is, grinding it out. In other places, that's seen as inefficient, or perhaps there's something wrong with that worker. Is this person the wrong role that they're at the office this late? Is the company understaffed? This is a problem. It's seen as a problem. It's not seen as some kind of heroic grind that you're subscribing to. And again, it's one of those things that we do it because we get these social cues that we're supposed to do it. But I just don't think that with the perspective of seeing what it's like in other places, it makes as much sense. And I think that's really what's curious about it, is how ingrained it is, how durable it is, because the idea that you can make it here is such a beautiful, seductive idea. And plenty of people have made it here. Plenty of people have come from nothing, have traveled from around the world from nothing to become something amazing. And those are the stories that we uphold. Unfortunately, there are tons of other stories about that not working out so well. And we tend to just kind of brush those under the rug, or say that person just didn't try hard enough. That's really what it comes down to, is that they didn't try hard enough. Because all you have to do is work hard in America and you'll get there.
Yeah.
And some people are just so invested in that idea of, the harder I work, the more likely it is I'll succeed. So even if they don't get that success, since they're so invested in it, it would be hard for them to probably back off of that mindset. They're just going to keep investing more and more. And then they'll also rationalize too along the way. They'll say, okay, fine, I worked so hard. Fine, I'm not going to make millions of dollars, but hey, maybe I have a chance at making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that, by the way, and that is achievable for sure. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, then they'll rationalize the next step. Okay, I didn't make hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe I didn't work hard enough, or I'll settle for this and still, keep investing in this idea. Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't think we have a lot of good messaging for what the alternative would be.
Right.
What is the ambition if it's not climbing the ladder and, acquiring really cool stuff and like having amazing experiences and just this really amazing, incredible, impressive, luxurious standard of life.
Mm-hmm.
And, what I think is more interesting to look at is, we do downplay community. We do downplay friends and family in our lives here. And that's sort of what I think a lot of people have been grappling with. And, the previous Surgeon General had a whole series of research and reports about the loneliness epidemic and all of these things that are kind of keeping us away from each other and making it difficult to interact with people. And to have to be a member of a community is an ambition. It can be as much of an ambition as, I have a good job, I make enough money, but I also have time for my friends. I also have time to know what's going on, to be around, to help people out, to be part of something that's greater than myself. That's another form of ambition, and I just don't think that we really focus on those things as being a way to be aspirational in our lives.
And here's the corollary to this. So I want to kind of bring it back a little bit. So again, going back to my libertarian days. So at the time I was taking an ethics and law class. And so the person who became my college mentor, Dr. Tim Stroop. So I'm going to kind of like briefly tell you a little bit about this, not to get into this too much. But so he essentially said, like, look, man, he's like, why don't you actually like read some of the books I sent you? He said, look, at the end of the day, man, he's like, I'm not trying to necessarily change your perspective, but he's like, I do want you to be able to see, would really know what you're arguing against rather than arguing against a straw man. So he sends me two really great books. One he actually sent me for my graduate school graduation. So one was called American Amnesia, pretty much about governments and government funding and how it influences R&D and other stuff, like pretty much industries, et cetera, various industries, et cetera. And then another one was called The Self-Made Myth. And The Self-Made Myth, interestingly, was the foreword was written by Bill Gates Sr. So what you take away from both of these books, and this is what I think now, here's like that talking about getting into the weeds. Now here's the sort of nefarious part, right? So on the one hand, you guys are talking about the psychology, like, oh, kind of people need to feel as though there's sort of hope for them. There's the sense that, okay, I don't necessarily need to rely on the system, et cetera, et cetera. But what you also get on the other end, like with these books, right? When it's so obvious to me how much government contributes to individual success, when it's so obvious how community broadly contributes to individual success, the sort of understanding that I took away from both of these books is that what these entrepreneurial types try to do is they try to dismantle the system for other people. So it's like, on the one hand, right, we could say, well, yeah, there's a sort of populace that's buying into this, like, obviously, and I was definitely one of these people where I just was like, I don't really want to rely on, let's say, kind of wealthier people because I don't know any. I also don't want to rely on the government because, like, who fuck them, like, who knows if they're going to want to like subsidize me or whatever, right? But then on the other end, you have like these sort of rich entrepreneurial types who are like, yes, no, fuck all of that, fuck community, fuck the government, you don't need any of that, you're good, you're a genius, you can make it work, right? So as I'm reading these books, I'm like, my God, man, so what these people are doing, and this is sort of what you're seeing with Musk now, right? So Musk, who's benefited significantly from the system, is piece by piece dismantling it. So everybody else, all of those people who are sort of clamoring to get up there, right? He's sort of on top kicking them all out.
Yeah. That is seen as an enemy of, the natural forces of man. If you really want to get into what some of the sort of tech elite have come to say and come to believe about what it means to actually be successful, it has nothing to do with government help. It has all to do with primal, like, alpha male energy, And yeah, the stories are ridiculous. I mean, Elon Musk is somebody who inherited millions of dollars from his, emerald mine owning dad in South Africa, on top of all the other stuff that he's gotten, through government subsidies and everything else. It is a big part of the story to sort of kick out the ladders out from other people who are trying to clamber up behind you. In large part because the ways that they are going to do that is through taxing the wealthy people. That's basically what it comes down to. And it again, this goes back to the passage about feeling like the most stoned kid on the Frisbee team. Like, this is stuff you hear all the time. It's actually real. Just because, like, the most liberal kid that is saying it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some truth. And there are things about this story that we really need to unpack and ask ourselves big questions about, because the version of the story that is winning and continues to win is not the right one that's going to get us to a safer, better place. It's gotten to us to where we are right now, and we're in big trouble. And it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And can we actually get into some of those details of exploitation, like for Musk and Henry Ford and other people along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those kinds of stories are, if you look at Elon Musk in 2018, tweeted out about what his ideal company work formula would be, what the work week would be. And he said, nobody changes the world on 40 hours a week. You got to work at least 80 hours a week. And then, like, at 100, that's where the pain really starts, but that's where you also see the gains. He's advocating for people to have no life, just to commit themselves to work. And at the same time, SpaceX and a lot of his companies have had all of these really terrible issues with safety because people are working too hard, because they're trying to undercut regulations, because there is corruption, because he's a powerful donor and individual. He doesn't get investigated. Regulators don't show up at his door as much as they could.
Mhm.
And all of those things ultimately lead us to this place where we talk about this guy wanting to go to Mars. And like, who all is coming to Mars? You know, the rest of us are here scrambling. There are all these sort of minutia bits of this story where because of a meeting, because of a friendship, because of a tax break or some kind of government research program, you can just up and leave from California and move your company to Texas because you want to not pay taxes on anything that you do. These are all just small examples. We don't even have to get into illegality. You know, we can just hang out in the legal zone and see all the things that are happening for it to be unfair. And again, it's not paying dividends for the entire country. It's not paying dividends for a lot of people. He is a myth in and of itself, but we are unfortunately focused on the wrong outcome. It's not that you want to be Elon Musk. It's that everyone around Elon Musk is somebody that made Elon Musk happen, and that means you and me. That means all of us. That means an entire system, and we should be able to share in that prosperity because he has so much money, and he's not working that much harder than the janitorial staff at the Tesla space facility. You know, those people are working hard too. And there are underlings and grunts all the way up to, the C-suite where he occupies, that are also working hard. And we need to resist those stories because they are so powerful and they are so seductive.
Right, because I think the libertarian, well, I know. So the libertarian perspective is essentially like, who are we as a people to limit any corporation, right? So let's say a corporation wants to go overseas, or even like, let's say in a limited way, obviously move from state to state. But like, who are we to say, like these people don't, or whatever, like these conglomerates essentially don't deserve that, fundamentally, if people are willing to pay for services, et cetera, they should kind of be allowed to move freely. But I think the point that people are missing is the fact that, if we're talking about power to like, let's say discrepancy, these corporations, I mean, fundamentally have too much of it, right? So I don't know how you get into the sort of moral issue of like what is and isn't too much. It's a bit tough, man. I mean, because it's all a little bit subjective when you think about it. But I think as a culture, we can say like, okay, here are these other societies, whether it's France, Spain, Denmark, whatever, right, that don't sort of give corporations outsized power. So I think, and I mean, Adam, please correct me if I'm wrong. So I think like the perspective of, let's say, a Bernie Sanders and an AOC, like where they say, healthcare is a right, et cetera. I don't necessarily think that that's the right perspective because it's very hard to pin this down morally, right? So because I think once you make it into a moral issue, then it becomes super fuzzy. Where again, on the other end, you have the libertarian perspective, which is like, well, who are you to say why corporations should be limited? They're not doing anything illegal, right? So you voted for these representatives. These representatives created these laws. Why isn't a mega multinational corporation? Why aren't they allowed to move freely through the world, right? That's why when people say things where like healthcare is a right and this is a right and that is a right, I don't think that that's the right perspective because there's no real resolution to it, right? So from my perspective, actually, I think the understanding is more about power differential, right? Do we want to live in a society that gives too much power to a sort of a group, a system, sort of in some a phantasm, right? The specter, whatever it is, right? Do we want to give it more power and feed it more power when we don't necessarily have to? Because again, the moral issue to me, I'm like, how does one win that?
Yeah, it's a good point. We need to focus ourselves on versions of the story that make sense to people because it isn't, the opposite of weak government, which we currently have. We have weak government is oligarchy. We have these powerful, extremely wealthy, rich people running around, basically dictating the policies of our country as a result of it. So that is a decision. That is a form of power. We're granting people power. This isn't liberty. This is just a bunch of rich people who now control things, as opposed to universal healthcare. I would make the argument for healthcare as saying we'll have a better economy with fewer deaths. The U.S. per capita spends twice as much on healthcare than almost all the Western European countries. Well, I'll take France again, since we're talking about France. We spend twice as much per year per person for healthcare in the U.S. than we do in France, which has universal healthcare.
Yep.
And the difference is our health outcomes are worse. We trail France by 5.5 years in life expectancy. The decisions that we're making aren't actually benefiting us. If they did, let's have that argument. Let's have those conversations about what it actually does for us to have a really threadbare social safety net, or no health insurance, or no easy health insurance in this country. That is, again, really shoddy. I mean, our healthcare system, even in its current form, even though there is more access to it than in previous generations, still sucks, and everybody knows it. Everybody's frustrated by it. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about why France's healthcare system is better than ours, and cheaper at the same time.
Wow.
Let's talk about what it means for us to, have doubled the size of the economy in the last 40 years. We've physically more than doubled the size of the economy, the US economy, in size and scope. We've become 64% more productive, but our workers are only making 17% more in terms of wages. If you don't have a college degree, or if you're a person of color, you're making less than you did in 1979 in real wages. That's information. That's a fact, and that is something that we need to ask, is that the right way to motivate people, to keep them encouraged and working in the workforce? I just think that if we want to build a better, more durable society and economy, there are ways to do that involve investing in people. And we just need to make those arguments better. So we don't get caught in these kind of like political, is it communism, is it socialism? No, it's smart business. It's smart business to have people have the tools to be socially mobile. If we're so obsessed with pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, giving somebody the opportunity to not have to drop out of school because a parent gets sick or anything like that, is better for us as a country and better for us as an economy. And if that's what we're so focused on, that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
And I just think that we'd boost our happiness, and we'd be better if we did.
And let me just say this one final thing about that. So
Sure.
last year I was dating somebody who legitimately changed my perspective on this, not exactly what we're talking about, but like this sort of more thematically. So
Sure.
we were talking about like, when does a person like have a right to break up with somebody, right? So my perspective is sort of like, the kind of more or less, let's say left leaning one, where it's like, no, it has to be moral. It has to feel ethical, right? And she was like, oh, you can just break up with somebody just because you don't want to date them anymore, right? And this fucking blew my mind, right? She's like, yeah. She's like, it's just a preference, right? So now applying that thought here, which to me, again, I may be completely off, but I just think it would be more helpful. So rather than going into let's prove that we're in the right, like the Bernie Sanders and the AOC, who are like, no, we're going to prove that this is a right. Why can't we just say, like a France or a Spain or whomever, like, hey, we just want to build a society that we prefer. We prefer that it's this way. We prefer not to grant the corporations this much power, right? We prefer not to have billionaires like Elon and whomever else, because we see what it's like in other places and even here, right? So the point is to say, and especially like in Russia, and where you have more of a oligarchy and dictatorships. So, but the point is to say, like, I really do think that we have to move away from the perspective of like, is this moral, to like, what do we just want as a broader society? I understand there are problems with democracy. I get it. Like, nothing is perfect, but the point is to say that we prefer this to that. So that's all.
Right. Yeah, no, we have to find a better way to message these things. And I think that is a huge reason why, the more progressive bent of American politics and global politics is having a really difficult time reckoning what to do about all of these huge issues, whether it's immigration or climate change or, unrest or economic stasis. Those are all things that are hard to argue against. What I would say to that is, how hard is it to go to, you're in Sheepshead Bay, what do you have to do when you go to the bathroom? You got to go to Starbucks, right?
Yeah.
Why don't we have public restrooms? Why in Los Angeles, when the fires come, wealthy people have to hire their own fire forces to battle the house, to save their own houses? Why don't we have enough investment in good water infrastructure and public services that everyone can actually have safe, a safe, effective force guard their homes when the fires come? These are just all kind of examples of how we've given all of this leeway to large companies, corporations, business in general, to run the basic features of our society. My first book was about fast food, and I grew up eating fast food. I'm from Texas. It's normal. A normal part of the experience is driving around. And what I found interesting is thinking about how fast food places become community centers. This is where old guys hang out in small towns, and even busy places too, because there's no place else to go, or they just want to be somewhere where there's action and it's cheap. You buy a cup of coffee and you hang out. This is also a place where kids who are, whose families can't afford Wi-Fi go to do their homework. These businesses are serving all these other functions that they weren't designed to serve. And instead of asking why we are so reliant on them, or building the infrastructure up to make it so that we don't need them for Starbucks has this controversial bathroom policy now because they're sick of having people come in just to use the bathroom, but you don't have a lot of options. And if you don't want to buy something, you're in a jam. Like you're literally and then people are complaining about, what's going on in the streets of New York with homeless people and not having places to go and things like that. Mm-hmm. There are all of these things that we rely on business to do for us. And when it's not in business's interest to provide it, everyone's just kind of left without an option. And that's a bad way to live. And I think we can make that argument with plenty of recent evidence to say, hey, this is a better way to live, where we actually have more dignity and decency in our lives. And that's who we say we are. We say we're a decent society. We try to say we're a decent society.
Yeah.
And something I'm very interested about in the book, you detail how some Americans are now rejecting traditional work models, whether it's by unionizing, gig work, remote work, that sort of thing. Do you think that is something, because I see it happening, we all see it happening, especially with the advent of remote work during and after COVID. Do you think that's something that's sustainable, or do you think corporations are going to just try to reassert control and try to return things to the status quo, I suppose, pre-COVID?
Yeah, I do think that the return to every day in the office is happening already. That's part of the Elon Musk Doge initiative, is to get federal workers in the office every single day. And there's nothing inherently wrong with going to the office every day the way that we did before, if it doesn't rob us of the ability to be there for our family, or to have like some kind of balance in our lives. I think that's part of the problem, is that we spend too much time in the office. We don't have enough opportunities to leave. We feel insecure if we leave and draw clear boundaries around our lives, or work comes home with us. It's on our phones. It's you're getting texts or Slack messages or emails at all odd hours of the night, and there's a cultural expectation to respond to those things. So it really takes us out of our ability to be present in our lives, and also just like, again, to be there for our families, for our friends, to have space that's separate from work. And that's something that I think we could stand to draw better boundaries on. But just in terms of work itself, we are seeing the return to the pre-COVID standards already in the public sector and in the private sector. And I think that's only going to take one recession or one little, set of layoffs to kind of instill fear in people to do whatever their employer says. And employers don't love the idea of employers working remotely or having a hybrid model. In part because they can't see what they're doing, and they're worried that they're not getting a return on their investment, whether it's real estate or just man hours. But people are being just as productive. That's the problem. They're being just as productive outside of the office as they were previously. And there are studies that show that. There's studies that show that even having a 4-day work week would allow people to orient their timing around work differently, so that they could have time to take care of things outside of the office, whether it's going to doctor's appointments or just running errands, without it all ending up on their leisure time. It's just about the balance being different. And we have a different economy than we did in the 1950s and 60s, where, manufacturing was a heavy part of how we lived. And you clock out at 5 and you go to the bar with your pals and you have some drinks and you go home and have dinner. That's not the way it is for a lot of people anymore.
Ooh, I'm curious, Adam, have you ever seen the Sylvester Stallone movie Fist?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow, nice. Okay, cool. So we can talk
Yeah.
about it. So, because not many people know it. So, so I actually love the movie. I know it was kind of critically panned. It's sort of based on Jimmy Hoffa's life a little bit, like
Yeah. Yeah.
loosely, right? So, remember the scene in the beginning of the movie? So, I guess just for our audience. So, in the beginning of the movie, there's this great scene where it's just a bunch of people. So they're standing outside, right? So
Mhm.
you have like a line of workers, like it's probably like dozens. I don't know. God
Yeah.
knows how many, right? And they're just waiting to get in, right? And then so one of these managers comes out and he's like, "Okay, I'll take you. I'll
You.
take
You.
you, and I'll take you, and then all of you guys get the fuck out of here, right?" And so
Right.
what's interesting is that when we think about these things, we're like, oh, that's a thing of the past, right? So it's not like that anymore, where there's the supply is sort of the demand outweighs the supply, right? But what's interesting is like I can speak about it, and I'm sure obviously you too, Adam, right? When you look at New York, it's actually like that. So there aren't that many jobs here. I know people think like, oh, fucking jobs are plentiful, it's a city or whatever, right? The thing that they miss is like it's not only just like outer boroughs or whatever, and like even kind of like Suffolk County, Westchester, whatever, who are competing for these jobs, but it's also people from other countries, definitely people from other states. So what I'm saying is that when we're going to this perspective and we're shifting to preference, right? It's sort of like I think what we're actually saying is that on the one hand, where there's let's say this again, kind of these conglomerates who are like, hey, well, we could just hire as many people as we want. We can kind of make the terms. You can negotiate if you'd like. You're free to do that, whatever that even means. What I like about the movie Fist is what it shows is in stark view in comparison to what people actually think. It shows in stark view that this is actually what life is really like, right? So why we want to take away power from these companies is because essentially it's, look, we're with Stallone, right? We're sort of on the kind of on the outside looking in, and we're like, hey, please give us a job. Like, yes, I understand a lot of us are educated, especially in New York. Some of us have went to grad school, whatever, right? But for the most part, when you actually, so let me just say this in terms of what people think again about New York. When somebody's competing for a job here, I know because I'm a therapist and I have patients who like look for work, who are out of work for God knows how long, and so people normally think this is such a myth. People think, oh, if you're out of work, like let's say if you get like let's say some sort of like severance package, you're probably going to be out of work for 3 months. Fucking wrong. A lot of
Right.
people are out, yeah, for like 6 months to a year. And again,
Wow.
this is in New York. I don't even know what it's like in other states, right? So why I point to the movie Fist is that we're literally like Stallone a lot of the times, and we're like, please, like begging for scraps. So when people say, hey, you should negotiate, you have the power to do that, we really fucking don't. Stallone in that movie and everybody in the 30s in Cleveland or wherever the fuck they were, they never
Right.
had the power to negotiate. So we technically a lot of the times we take what we can get.
Yeah, well, a business drives working culture in the country, and that's what's separate about the United States compared to other places. Like again, going back to Europe again, where there is more union density, where there are more people in unions. Um, we're in this strange moment because in the U.S., public sentiment for unions has never been higher. They're
Mm.
polling people, they're saying more people say that we need strong unions in this country, and union membership at the same time has never been lower. So we're at like sentiment versus reality has never been more divergent. And that's important because we have to sort of understand what it means to have business set the culture in our, for our working culture. And if we have unions do it, or we have, again, stronger committees at work, or people who are willing to sort of, again, represent broadly what workers want in the company, yeah, it becomes a negotiation, and it becomes something where you can say, no, you really can't get in touch with us at 9 o'clock at night and expect us to reply. That's just not realistic, But because union power is weak and bargaining power is weak, we end up having government, sorry, corporations and big companies basically dictating the terms of how work is. And there is an alternative to that. That's just, again, it's a negotiation. It's not that unions run every other country. It's that there are these balances, and our balance is out of whack. Our balance gives too much power to um, powerful interests that, again, don't pay their fair share and don't treat their workers well. And we need more, individuals to be able to come together and say, look, this isn't sustainable. This isn't good for business. And that's what's crazy about the story in general for me, is that companies in America lose $1 trillion with a T to attrition and people leaving their jobs every
Yeah.
year. That is money that is profit. That is Amazon lost $8 billion in the year 2021
Mm.
because people couldn't stay at the job for more than 2 months.
Wow.
That's somebody you trained, that's somebody you onboarded, that's somebody who fit into a sort of ecosystem, and there's morale and there's loss training. There are all these costs associated with someone leaving their job. If you just treated people better, you would make that money back. It's actually smarter business to treat your employees better because they're more loyal, they're more creative, they're more committed, they are doing better work when they have more leisure time or more separation between work and home. These are things that like basically all of these European countries that have all these strong union forces and social safety nets and all of these strange cultural things that seem weird to us, they have all this data that says this is why we're continuing to do it, because it's smart business to give people this many days off the year. And we don't have we have the fewest number of those days per year in the Western world. And it's important to ask why, because it does cost us things. And people don't even take the allotted time that they have off because they don't feel like it's their own time. I think it's 47% of Americans don't take all their days off. And even in the companies where you're given endless days off, those people take even fewer days off. When you're given unlimited PTO, people at Oracle and Google and all these big companies that have instituted unlimited time off, those people take even fewer days off because it feels like selfish to take your own time and to say, I don't want to be a pain or I don't want to leave the work to somebody else. But like you actually do need that time off in your life. And that's what happens when the working culture is dictated by the interests of business and solely business and not the workers who put in the sweat and help make the profits happen and help make the creativity go and turn companies into juggernauts.
Wow. And what's such a smack in the face to me, like I guess not that kind of smack in the face, but like a slap from reality, is that like if you think about it, these myths perpetuate, I guess, a desire to let's say kind of stand out, obviously, for lack of better words. But I think the point is to say like they sort of tell you like, hey, if you're so special that like you stand out, that you can make yourself let's say like a genius of sorts, right? You can be above this, right? You can negotiate whatever you want. But what's so interesting is that I think it feels like not even just a paradox, because it feels like a contradiction. It's even deeper than that, where on the one hand, you have this sense of like, okay, I'm going to hustle, I'm going to stand out, I'm going to be the genius. But then when I negotiate and when I'm one of these people who don't really take days off, right? I literally act like I'm somebody with no leverage, right? So it's like the working person on the one hand has to deal with this sort of dichotomy where on the one hand, you're like, okay, I'm sort of chiseling away, again, this moral masochism, right? I'm suffering and I'm striving and I'm sort of becoming the best, or maybe I even think I am implicitly or secretly the best. But on the other hand, I literally know in the world I have no leverage. And I just wonder how people, if they even try to make sense of that.
It's a good question. I mean, I think that's why we have so many crazy self-help books and, why if you ever sign into LinkedIn, it's just like someone's really intense story about like why getting their dry cleaning reminded them of like being in a negotiation or something. Like there are all these like nonsense sort of social cues that we're getting from all over the place about how to make sense of the world, because it is difficult to make sense of it. We're all left on our own to kind of make sense of how things are supposed to work, of what work is supposed to be like, what ambition is supposed to be like. And unfortunately, in other places, there are advocates for that. There are people who say, here's a union leader, here's somebody who I know, or a boss that I like that I know can advocate for what would be best for the team. And sometimes that happens on its own in America. There are places where you can have good jobs. There are places where you work hard and you find your way up. It's not all bad. It's just we have no standard. You can go from one good job and get a better job at another company and then realize the culture of that company is disastrous. And because we have no baseline, we have no culture where expectations are set at a certain level in terms of working hours, in terms of what it means to have time off, in terms of after work communications, about compensation, about all these different things. You can theoretically go from one secure. This is why people stay at jobs that they know are like either easy or good. We all know someone who's like, yeah, I got a good thing going. Like it doesn't pay me the most, but like I know that, my boss is nice. I know that my hours are good and I'm just going to stay here, because you go anywhere else and it's a gamble. Everyone has taken on the new job and realized, oh wow, this place is a nightmare or a sinking ship, or there's no balance here, there's no good management here. And unfortunately, those are things that happen when you don't have a standard. We just have no standards here.
Yeah. Something I'm curious about is with the advent of the development of AI automation. do you think that somewhere down the line, that's going to make life easier for the average American, or do you think it's harder and we need things like UBI, universal basic income? Um, what's something I guess that we could do to kind of combat the realities that we're currently facing and that we're projected to face? Yeah.
Right. Well, it's a good question. In large part because we don't really know what's going to happen with AI, right?
Right.
It could be a bust, but it could also be it could also be something that totally changes the way that people work and takes millions of jobs away. And I think given the fact that we don't know the answer to that, it would be wise for us to have in place some kind of safeguard for people.
Hmm.
And universal basic income is a really good example of that. In the book, I talked to Andrew Yang, who's obviously one of the big advocates for universal basic income. But I also talked to people who are just looking at it from a smaller scale thing. It's not about giving everybody $1,000 a month, which again would be expensive, but I think we waste a lot of money on other things that we could probably, ultimately pay for if we decided to stop rolling back tax cuts for super wealthy people, or even just, invest all kinds of money in defense that we have kind of proven don't really need. But without digressing too much into that crazy land, when it comes down to it, universal basic income or just having a negative income tax. That's another version of this where anyone who is below the poverty line or at the poverty line, we bring them up to 150% of the poverty line.
Mm.
And that means we just eradicate poverty. It's much cheaper than giving everybody $1,000 a month. But what it does is basically make sure that we have a basic standard of living and nobody can drop below that. And that is a way to safeguard against bad jobs, where you're working some terrible job and you can't quit because you'll go hungry.
Right.
And that's how they have you. That's how a lot of low wage employers have you. They know you don't have a lot of opportunities or other options, especially in parts of the country where there aren't that many jobs. They
Right.
can afford to treat you poorly. And you really can't do anything about it. But having those kinds of safeguards against AI, but also just bad employers, is something that would be a good reason to pursue something like maybe not a full universal basic income, but just a negative tax income, or a negative, negative tax income. And that would change the way that we interact with work, again, in ways that would give workers power to say no to bad jobs, but also empower them to have better lives. We did this during the pandemic. We had the expanded child tax credit, which
Right.
basically gave every parent $250 or $300 a month to raise their kids, and per child. And it was available to poor people for the first time, really low income people that are usually excluded from that for the first time ever. And it proved to be very successful. We eradicated child poverty. We cut it more than half. And people were able to pay down debt and get control of their lives and be ambitious again. This is, again, about the tools to actually be socially mobile. If we are going to be the rags to riches bootstraps country, we have to give people the tools to do it, because right now they just don't have them. And we didn't extend it, and we didn't make it actually something that, even though we had all this good evidence that this is a smart thing for us to do, we were, one vote shy in the Senate for making it, extending it or making it permanent, and it didn't happen. And now we're seeing all this household record debt, and we're seeing all this anger. And I think it's because people feel unsupported. And for a minute, they actually felt supported.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that point, man. So, like, when I was a libertarian, I would argue as most of them, right? I was such a fucking hypocrite, man. So, like, legitimately, I had a childhood that was pretty much marked by government subsidies, right? So, we were on Section 8 housing. My mom, so because we're immigrants, when we came to the country, we were on welfare during the Clinton years, which was pretty big for a long time. Obviously, it got cut off, at some point down the line, especially with Bush. But the point is to say that, like, here I am as a libertarian, and I'm fucking talking about picking yourself up by your bootstraps or whatever. But the point is to say that that a lot of so education was subsidized, right, with FAFSA and TAP grants, and they were grants, not loans for me, right, because we were so fucking poor. Then again, Section 8 housing, food stamps, we definitely were on that for a very long time. So what's so interesting is that, like, and this was a lot of the same thing for the people that I knew as well, right? For us in the kind of neighborhood, right? A lot of us who became like relatively successful in whatever terms you want to judge that. So I would say a lot of us had a foundation that our parents just alone wouldn't have been able to provide us. And that's the point that you're essentially making. You're saying that, like, hey, unless, like, you know, you're pretty much not necessarily a rich kid, but you're like a middle class kid, which a lot of us certainly aren't and weren't. So the point is to say, unless you're kind of that, you're not really going to get the support necessary. So with these particular, whether it's tax credits, direct subsidies, for a lot of these kids, they don't really have these chances that other people do, and they never will, because fundamentally, so it's like, it's the Jerry Maguire quote, man. It's show me the money. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, you could give them, you know, your stories, and you could sort of give them your books or whatever it is and your ideas. But at the end of the day, if, for me, at least personally, I would say it's literally the money that directly helped me.
Yeah, it's the easiest way to make these things. Again, we have so much evidence of this over the last several decades of different experiments that we've tried, not just in other countries. I'm talking about in the US specifically, that kind of just show that if you give people a little bit of support, they don't squander it. They don't go out and spend like whatever money they get by and large on, you know, drugs or alcohol or cigarettes or whatever it is. If you give people a sense of stability, they are able to be ambitious in ways that they're not able to be ambitious when you are so worried about the next 5 minutes or 5 days of your life. That you can look to what next month will bring, what opportunities, how I can schedule my life or arrange my life that would allow me to get further along than I currently am. And that is, again, just something that we have evidence of, that we just need to make the case for. And it has its opponents. It has its opponents for the wrong reasons. We've turned it into, you know, a socialism or a communism or a handouts thing versus like an investment in people. And we have invested in people in the past. The GI Bill is a perfect example of something that the government did, you know, in exchange for military service that transformed the country and helped build this really durable middle class in American life. That is something that no one looks back and says the GI Bill was a mistake. They think of it as a time when America made sense and was good and was invested in people's ambition. And we could do things like that for people and give them the opportunity and the tools to, again, seize ambition, but also be productive and have opportunities that pay out not just in their own lives and for the economy, but in the business. In the business world, but also in their communities and their family lives. You know, we could have more stability on all of these fronts where things are so fractious right now.
Yeah. And let me tell you this. So interestingly, it was my last thought on this part. So when we were on like all of those benefits or whatnot, so there was a time where this is when I went to college. So there was a huge, I would say, I don't know, whatever, I guess you kind of call it a backlash. So from like just people I knew, broader culture on the whole, right? So like with FAFSA, right? So for people who don't know the CUNY system, so technically if you're like super, super poor, and at the time, me and my mom were literally surviving on like less than $1,000 a month, which is just fucking nuts. So like from her job. So the point is to say, so when you're super poor, what happens is there's a surplus, right? So they kind of give you more money than you need for your tuition, right? And so people are like, oh, why are they doing that? You know, like these fucking kids are just spending their money on like fucking iPhones or whatever else. The thing that they didn't know is that a lot of that money actually went toward our rent. So even though like I technically didn't have a job, I was a complete like full-time student. The like surplus of money from FAFSA, that was literally just going to pay for like necessities and rent. So yes, at the end of the day, it wasn't particularly for my tuition. And yes, I understand. I mean, there should have been other programs there, but like, fuck, man, if I didn't have like that extra whatever it was, so I think the leftover was maybe like anywhere from $800 to like $1,000, which again, I guess I understand, because if that's not part of your tuition, it's like, why the fuck is FAFSA covering it? Totally understandable. But yeah, man, a lot of that money went actually toward rent and necessities. So I'm like, it's not like I was spending it on an iPhone or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And that's a pretty common story when you look at our basic income experiments around the country, and they have the data to back up that people, even when given the expanded child tax credit, use it for good reasons. And it's important to look at those things and see what they enabled. And again, it is in the vein of the GI Bill. It is in the vein of all of these things that we've done in the past to support people after the Civil War, throughout the country's history, we have these moments where we've done these really impressive things in times of great distress that gave us extra, capacity to transcend ourselves collectively, not just like on an individual level, but as not just as individuals, but as citizens and as a country. And that's something that's missing from the discourse right now, because we are very much in the individualistic only kind of, let's idolize these certain success stories that appear to be self-made but are not. And that's that's the thick of the story.
Absolutely, man.
Something I'm just super curious about. If you could see one major policy change as a result of this book's impact, what would you like to see the most?
Um, I would honestly be great with the expanded child tax credit coming back.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
just it doesn't have to be a grand changing policy. Universal basic income would be amazing, don't get me wrong, but like if we just set people on a little course of understanding what it means to support people, especially working parents, and we saw the benefit from that, I just think it would change the entire nature of the relationship between people and government, because we have all this negative, fury around government waste and things that we see and are kind of exploited for political gain. But we don't see all the good work that government does and what career workers do in federal and local levels.
Mhm.
We're out here bashing these things, and just having something that basically gives parents and families a little bit of security would go a long way in bettering outcomes of not just the economy, but individual achievement. Child hunger, child poverty, family poverty, debt, all of these different things would be solved if we just gave a little boost. And I don't think it has to be this ground shaping, ground changing, earth shattering thing. It can be just as small as the extended child tax credit.
I love that. All right, Alan. So as we wrap up, final questions for Adam.
Oh, yes, yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
I would just say go to adamchandler.com. It's kind of where I keep all of my writing and things that I'm working on. I'm a working journalist, and it's where information about the book is. I'm doing a lot of events these days, and so I'll be out there in the world. And I have an email there. If anyone wants to drop me a line, I love hearing people's stories. In the book, I go around and I talk to construction worker in Wisconsin and a pastor in Alabama, and the mayor of Baltimore, and someone who served in the army while they were undocumented to get citizenship, and all these different stories that kind of make up what I think give us a better sense of what American citizenship is like. And so I love hearing from people, and so I want to say I'm open to that. But yeah, that's probably the best place.
And where can we buy the book?
Anywhere. I'd say look for your local bookstore is the great place to go. If you want to go through Amazon, go through Amazon. Ask your library for it if you don't feel like buying it. It's good for me and it's good for everybody. But yeah, definitely invest in your libraries. And yeah, I narrated the audiobook like a real psychopath, and that's it. I had a great time with it.
I love it. Adam, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was legit one of my top 5 favorite podcasts, man.
Oh, thank you so much. I had a great time and I appreciate the invite.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you
Take care.
soon.
Awesome. All right. So, everyone, as you know, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.